On the afternoon of February 21st, 1965, the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan filled slowly with families, students, and supporters. It was a cold Sunday, the kind of New York winter day where coats stayed buttoned indoors. The atmosphere was attentive, but not tense. There was no sense, at least among most of those present, that history was about to fracture. At approximately 3 p.m., MalcomX stepped toward the lectern to begin an address for the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He had returned to public speaking after months marked by personal strain, ideological transition, and increasing isolation. The speech never began. Moments later, gunfire erupted. Within minutes, Malcolm X was mortally wounded. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. He was 39 years old. This sequence of events is widely known. It appears in textbooks, documentaries, and commemorations. Yet over time, the assassination has often been simplified into a narrow narrative. A sudden act of violence, attributed to a few identified individuals, neatly closing the story of a controversial figure. What tend to be softened, sometimes unintentionally, is the full historical context surrounding that day, the conditions that preceded it, and the unresolved questions that remain afterward. This documentary does not seek to dramatize or speculate. Instead, it aims to examine the assassination as a historical event shaped by real pressures, documented conflicts, and institutional responses that were present long before that afternoon. In early 1965, Malcolm X was no longer the man many Americans thought they knew. After leaving the Nation of Islam in March 1964, he had publicly broken with its leadership and doctrine. He had founded Muslim Mosque Incorporated and later the Organization of Afro-American Unity, signaling a shift toward broader political engagement and international human rights advocacy. This transition came at a cost. Malcolm X had lost organizational protection, financial stability, and many former allies. At the same time, his public profile remained high. He was traveling, speaking, and granting interviews that reflected a more global outlook on racial injustice, connecting the Black American experience to decolonization movements in Africa and Asia. These changes placed him in a vulnerable position. His home in Queens was firebombed just 1 week before the assassination, while he and his family were inside. The incident was reported, investigated, and survived, but it did not result in lasting protective measures. By the time he arrived at the Audubon Ballroom, Malcolm X was aware of threats against his life. This was not speculation. It was documented in interviews and public statements. Despite this awareness, security at the event was minimal. The ballroom itself was a familiar venue, previously used for meetings and lectures, and it did not resemble a high-risk environment. When the shooting occurred, confusion followed immediately. Witnesses described multiple assailants, rapid movement, and panic in the crowd. Law enforcement responded quickly, but clarity did not. In the hours and days that followed, the public was presented with a straightforward explanation. Members of the Nation of Islam were responsible, acting independently. 3 men were eventually convicted for the murder in 1966. At the time, the case was considered resolved. Yet even in that moment, there were inconsistencies. Witness accounts varied. Evidence handling raised questions. Some individuals named by witnesses were never called to testify. Others who were convicted later maintained their innocence. For decades, these issues remained largely absent from mainstream historical discussion. The assassination was treated as a tragic endpoint rather than a subject requiring continued examination. Malcolm X himself was often frozen in time, remembered either as a radical firebrand or as a symbol of transformation, rarely as a human being navigating danger in real time. What history softened was not the violence itself, but the complexity surrounding it. This softening did not occur because facts were hidden, but because they were uncomfortable. A full accounting requires acknowledging that Malcolm X existed at the intersection of multiple tensions: religious schism, ideological evolution, racial surveillance, and internal community conflict. These forces did not vanish on the day of his death. They converged. Understanding this convergence matters, not to assign modern political meaning and not to reopen wounds, but to treat history with accuracy and seriousness. Assassinations do not occur in isolation. They are the culmination of pressures that can be documented, traced, and examined without speculation. By the beginning of 1965, Malcolm X was living in a condition historians often describe cautiously: political exposure without institutional protection. This was not a metaphor. It was a measurable reality shaped by his departure from a nation of Islam, his public realignment of beliefs, and the absence of any formal security structure around him. For more than a decade, Malcolm X had operated within an organization that provided discipline, hierarchy, and controlled access. The Nation of Islam regulated events, managed venues, and enforced internal order. When Malcolm X left in March 1964, that infrastructure vanished overnight. What replaced it was independence, but independence without insulation. This transition period is essential to understanding the vulnerability that followed. Malcolm X was not retreating from public life. On the contrary, he was expanding it. He traveled extensively across the United States, Africa, and the Middle East. He met with heads of state, addressed university audiences, and spoke openly to the press about race, power, and international law. These activities increased his visibility. At the same time, they reduced his protection. His ideological shift also complicated how he was perceived. Malcolm X no longer spoke exclusively in the absolutist language that had defined his earlier public image. After his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, his language reflected a broader, more inclusive framework. He emphasized human rights alongside civil rights and framed racial injustice in the United States as a matter of global concern. This evolution did not erase his critics. Instead, it multiplied them. Former allies felt betrayed. Opponents remained hostile. Some audiences were uncertain how to interpret the changes. What remained constant was attention. Malcolm X continued to command it, often without the buffers that typically surround public figures of comparable influence. Threats against his life were not abstract. They were documented. Malcolm X spoke about them publicly and privately. He informed associates that he believed he was being watched. His family later confirmed that he expected violence, though not necessarily when or where it would occur. 1 week before his assassination, on February 14, 1965, his home in East Elmhurst, Queens, was firebombed in the early morning hours. Malcolm X, his wife Betty Shabazz, and their children escaped without physical injury. The incident was reported in major newspapers. Authorities investigated. No one was charged. What matters historically is not speculation about responsibility, but the response. Despite the seriousness of the attack, there was no sustained police protection assigned to Malcolm X or his family. No permanent security detail followed him to events. The firebombing did not alter how his public appearances were managed. This absence of institutional response reflected a broader pattern. Malcolm X no longer belonged to a major organization that could exert political pressure on his behalf. His newer groups, Muslim Mosque Incorporated and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, were still forming, with limited resources and limited reach. At the same time, his rhetoric placed him at odds with dominant narratives of the era. He criticized gradualism, questioned integration strategies, and openly challenged U.S. moral authority on the international stage. These positions did not fit comfortably within mainstream civil rights discourse, nor were they aligned with radical underground movements. As a result, Malcolm X existed in a narrow space between categories. He was too prominent to be ignored, too independent to be shielded, and too unconventional to be easily defended. Public speaking engagements continued nonetheless. The Audubon Ballroom was chosen for the February 21st event because it was familiar, accessible, and affordable. Security planning was informal. Volunteers handled logistics. The environment was assumed to be safe based on precedent rather than risk assessment. From a historical perspective, this assumption stands out. By early 1965, Malcolm X was a man who had survived internal conflict, public schism, and a direct attack on his home. Yet his movements remained largely unprotected. This is not an argument. It is a documented condition. When violence eventually occurred, it did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a convergence of isolation, visibility, and unresolved conflict. These factors are often softened in retrospective accounts because they complicate the narrative of individual guilt and individual tragedy. To acknowledge vulnerability is not to assign blame. It is to recognize that history unfolds within structures, and the absence of structure can be as consequential as its presence. By the time Malcolm X stepped onto the stage at the Audubon Ballroom, he carried the weight of these conditions. He was still shaping his political future, still refining his message, still engaged in dialogue rather than retreat. His assassination froze that process in time. In the hours following the assassination of Malcolm X, public shock was immediate, but official certainty arrived just as quickly. By the end of February 21st, 1965, authorities had already begun shaping a clear narrative of responsibility. Within days, arrests were made. Within months, the case appeared settled. From a historical standpoint, the speed is notable. Law enforcement apprehended one suspect at the scene after he was injured by members of the audience. 2 others were arrested later. All 3 were affiliated, at varying levels, with the Nation of Islam. In 1966, after a highly publicized trial, they were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. At the time, the outcome satisfied a public desire for resolution. Malcolm X had been a polarizing figure, and the explanation offered aligned with widely understood tensions between him and the Nation of Islam after his departure. The case fit an existing frame, and for many observers, that was enough. Yet, when examined closely, the investigation reveals gaps that were visible even then. Eyewitness testimony was inconsistent. Some witnesses described more assailants than those charged. Others named individuals who were never called to testify. Certain accounts conflicted with physical evidence, while others were later retracted or revised. These inconsistencies were documented in court records, but were largely overshadowed by the broader narrative of organizational retaliation. Evidence handling also raised concerns. Key materials were not preserved with the rigor expected in a case of this magnitude. Some items were lost. Others were never formally introduced. The chain of custody was not always clear. None of this invalidated convictions outright, but it complicated the claim that the full scope of the crime had been addressed. Equally important is what the investigation did not pursue. The focus remained narrow, centered on individual perpetrators rather than the wider environment of threats, surveillance, and conflict surrounding Malcolm X at the time. No sustained inquiry examined whether prior warnings had been acted upon adequately. No public accounting addressed why security was minimal despite documented risks. These questions were not framed as investigative priorities. This narrowing of focus was not unusual for the era. Law enforcement institutions often favored swift closure over expansive examination, particularly in politically sensitive cases. The assassination of Malcolm X occurred during a period of intense social upheaval, when authorities faced pressure to demonstrate control and stability. Closure served that purpose. For the public, the trial offered a sense of finality. For historians, it offered something else, a record that appeared complete on the surface but left important areas unexplored. Over time, the official version of events became dominant, repeated in textbooks and media accounts with little modification. As decades passed, the assassination was increasingly described as an internal conflict that resolved itself through the justice system. The broader context, the isolation Malcolm X faced, the documented threats, the lack of protective response, faded into the background. This process is what historians often mean when they speak of softening. It does not involve erasing facts, but arranging them in a way that reduces complexity. The story becomes easier to tell, easier to remember, and easier to close. For the men convicted, the consequences were absolute. Two consistently maintained their innocence. Their claims were dismissed for years, often without detailed examination. Appeals were denied. The case remained officially closed. Yet historical cases do not remain static simply because legal ones do. New evidence can emerge. Records can be reevaluated. Institutional practices can be reassessed with greater distance and transparency. By the late 20th century, scholars, journalists, and legal advocates began to revisit the assassination with renewed attention. They did not dispute that Malcolm X was killed by gunmen at the Audubon Ballroom. They questioned whether the investigation had captured the full truth of how and why it happened. These inquiries did not gain immediate traction. The weight of official history is heavy, and revising it requires patience and documentation. Still, the questions persisted, largely outside mainstream discourse. For more than half a century, the assassination of Malcolm X remained legally closed and publicly settled. The convictions handed down in 1966 stood as the final word, repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and institutional summaries. The story appeared complete. Yet history has a way of returning to questions that were answered too quickly. The reopening of this case did not begin with rumor or speculation. It began with records. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, journalists and legal researchers gained broader access to archival materials from the 1960s. These included trial transcripts, police memoranda, and federal files that had not been widely examined together. When viewed collectively, these documents revealed omissions that were difficult to dismiss as incidental. One of the most significant developments came from investigative reporting that compared eyewitness accounts with trial testimony. Several witnesses who were present at the Audubon Ballroom described individuals involved in the shooting who did not match the men convicted. Some named suspects who were never called to testify. Others stated that their accounts had been minimized or redirected during the original investigation. Equally consequential were revelations about withheld information. Records later showed that law enforcement agencies possessed intelligence related to the case that was not disclosed to the defense during trial. This information included surveillance data and informant reports that could have altered the scope of questioning or introduced reasonable doubt. These findings did not immediately overturn the official narrative. Institutional histories are resistant to revision, especially when decades have passed. However, they prompted renewed scrutiny, this time grounded not in ideology, but in procedural accountability. In 2020, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office formally reopened the investigation into Malcolm X's assassination. This decision was not symbolic. It reflected a recognition that the original case required reevaluation under modern standards of evidence and disclosure. The review involved collaboration with legal advocates and the family of Malcolm X. It examined thousands of pages of archival material, focusing on whether convictions had been obtained through a fair and complete process. The scope was deliberately narrow. The goal was not to rewrite history, but to determine whether justice had been properly served. In 2021, the results of that review became public. 2 of the 3 men convicted of Malcolm X's murder were exonerated. The court acknowledged that critical evidence had been withheld and that the trial did not meet the standard of fairness required by law. The 3rd man had died years earlier, and his conviction remained formally unresolved. This moment marked a rare institutional admission. It did not claim to identify all individuals responsible for the assassination. It did not assign new guilt. It acknowledged something more precise and more consequential. The official account had been incomplete. For historians, this acknowledgement mattered deeply. It confirmed that earlier concerns about the investigation were not speculative. They were grounded in documented reality. The case had closed quickly, but not cleanly. The exonerations forced a reevaluation of how MalcomX's death had been remembered. If two convictions were invalid, then the simplified narrative, an internal dispute conclusively resolved, could no longer stand as the sole explanation. The assassination returned to history as an open question, not in terms of who pulled the trigger, but in terms of how institutions responded before and after the event. This reopening did not transform Malcolm X into a martyr beyond criticism, nor did it reposition him within modern political debates. Instead, it restored historical complexity. It allowed scholars to revisit the conditions described in earlier chapters: vulnerability without protection, warnings without response, and investigation without full disclosure. Importantly, the official review avoided sensationalism. It did not accuse agencies of conspiracy or intentional deception. It focused on procedural failure, on what was not shared, not pursued, and not questioned. That distinction matters. History does not require dramatic villains to reveal structural flaws. Sometimes it requires only patience, access to records, and the willingness to admit error. The reopening of the Malcolm X case demonstrated that historical truth is not static. It evolves as institutions become more transparent, and as societies recalibrate their standards of accountability. What was once considered sufficient can later be recognized as incomplete. For Malcolm X's family, the exonerations did not erase loss. They did not restore a life interrupted at 39. What they did provide was acknowledgement that the story told for decades had failed to reflect the full reality of what happened. The reassessment of Malcolm X's assassination did not rewrite his life. It clarified how his death had been remembered. That distinction is essential. Historical honesty is not about elevating figures into symbols beyond scrutiny, nor is it about reducing them to victims of a single moment. It is about restoring proportion. Malcolm X's legacy has often been divided into phases. The early years of anger and absolutism, followed by a later period of reflection and expansion. This framing, while useful, can obscure something more important. His life was not a clean arc toward resolution. It was a process still unfolding when it was abruptly interrupted. The reassessment of his assassination forces historians to confront that interruption directly. For decades, Malcolm X was remembered primarily through his words. Speeches, interviews, and writings defined him in public memory. His death, by contrast, was treated as an endpoint, tragic but settled. The reopening of the case disrupted that balance. It required attention not just to what he said, but to how institutions responded to his presence, his vulnerability, and his warnings. What emerges is not a story of conspiracy or inevitability. It is a story of limitation. Malcolm X operated at a moment when American institutions struggled to engage figures who did not fit established categories. He was not aligned with mainstream civil rights leadership, nor was he underground. He rejected violence while defending self-determination. He criticized the United States while appealing to its legal and moral frameworks. This complexity made him difficult to manage and easier to isolate. That isolation matters historically because it shaped the conditions of his final year. It explains why threats were documented but not mitigated, why protection was informal, and why his assassination could occur in a public venue without significant preventive measures. The later exonerations did not identify every failure or assign comprehensive responsibility. They did something quieter but more enduring. They acknowledged that the official account had been insufficient. That acknowledgement altered the historical record. For future generations, this shift changes how Malcolm X is studied. His assassination can no longer be treated as a closed chapter appended to his biography. It becomes part of the same continuum as his political evolution, a moment shaped by structure, response, and omission. This has implications beyond Malcolm X himself. Historical memory often favors simplicity. It prefers clean resolutions and singular causes. Complex events are compressed to fit educational narratives and broadcast formats. Over time, nuance is lost not through deception, but through repetition. The phrase history softened does not imply intent. It describes a process. Details fade. Context narrows. Questions are deemed settled because revisiting them feels destabilizing. Yet stability built on incompleteness is fragile. In MalcomX's case, the correction arrived decades later, through records preserved by institutions that once failed to fully examine them. This paradox is not unique. It is how historical accountability often works. Slowly, imperfectly, and without spectacle. What remains unresolved is not a list of names, but a deeper question. How many other historical figures exist within similarly softened narratives? How many lives were shaped by systems that responded inadequately, then documented incompletely? Answering that question does not diminish Malcolm X's legacy. It strengthens it. He argued consistently for clarity about power, responsibility, and truth. An honest account of his death aligns with that principle. It resists myth-making and refuses to treat tragedy as a narrative convenience. Malcolm X's influence endures not because he was flawless, but because he was evolving. His assassination halted that evolution, but it did not freeze his meaning. Each generation encounters him differently, informed by new records and new standards of accountability. This documentary does not claim to close the story. It does the opposite. It places Malcolm X back into history as a figure shaped by real forces, living within real constraints, and remembered through institutions capable of error as well as correction. An honest memory requires that balance. History did not soften Malcolm X by hiding who he was. It softened the circumstances of his death by simplifying them. Restoring that complexity does not reopen wounds. It honors truth. And in doing so, it allows Malcolm X to remain what he always was. Not a finished symbol, but challenge.